All right, Rabbi say good. So beautiful to start out the morning with a little bit of Ramchal. So special. All right, Rabbi say good morning. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Daf Chof in Meseches Yevamos. So we begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan. To thank Doctors Paul Zichron Levracha and Linda Weinberg for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in commemoration of the 36th yahrzeit of their son Mordechai Yehoshua, ben Peretz Moshe Zichron Levracha and Miriam. We thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in the zchus of refuah sheileimah for Kathy's sister Donna Baker-Matson. We thank Teri Czinn for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their third grandchild, Bunim Tzvi Hersch. We thank Naftali Tilson, our Talmud Torah sponsor, with thanks to his good friend, Benjamin Wohl, and a thank you to the entire shir, wishing everyone a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. And also we thank all of our sponsors, all of the neshama shav and aliyah, and the feelings of gratitude and achdos and friendship and chaver should increase. And with that, let us begin. Today's daf Chof Ches. A lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. We are picking up on Chav Zayin and Beis, and we left off. Let's pick up V'Rav Leslie High Svara, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. So we'll say, remember again, we actually left off in what I thought was a really fascinating sugya. So remember again, just very quickly, we had a statement in the name of Rav. Who just said the name of Rav? The following case. Beis Achayos Yevamos. Here was the case. Two sisters, right? It was the case we were dealing with the most of yesterday, right? So Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, and there's a third brother, Levi. Levi's not married. Let's assume right now Levi's single. So what happens? Reuven and Shimon pass away. So now halacha l'maisa, these two achayos, these two sisters fall before Levi for yibum. So Rav's statement was like this. Okay, so remember again, he can't do yibum. Obviously, right? Achos zikukaso. That was the primary case we've been dealing with up on this entire time. Achos zikukaso. So can't do yibum. So he has to do chalitza. Okay, so again, he could do chalitza with Rachel, do chalitza with Leah. Fine. What happens if one of them dies? Rachel or Leah dies. So Rabbi says, remember again, Rav himself said that halacha l'maisa, if one of them dies, then what? Yibum is possible. And Rav said it's either one who dies. Now, obviously, in the case where what we'll call Leah, the second wife dies, the second Yevama dies, it's even better. I don't mean, you understand how I mean it. Right? It's even better in terms of what? Because remember again, Rachel, the first wife, but when she first fell into the Yibum pool, she was permitted, because she was the only one. Then Leah came along, prohibited her from Yibum. If Leah dies, Rachel simply returns to her previously permitted Yibum state. But according to Rav, even if Rachel dies, Leah becomes permitted in Yibum. Rabbi Yochanan came along and said, I agree with you regarding Rachel, disagree with you regarding Leah. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan will say like this. Your Yibum eligibility is determined when? At the moment you fall into the Yibum pool. So therefore, again, says Rabbi Yochanan, Rachel, when she fell into the Yibum pool, she was permitted. Right? Because remember again, Leah wasn't in the picture. She subsequently becomes prohibited when Leah becomes eligible for Yibum. But if Leah dies, Rachel returns back to her previous eligibility. But Leah was never eligible. Right? Leah was never eligible. Because Lamaisa, the moment that Leah fell to the Yibum pool, who else was in the pool? Right? Everybody in the pool. Who else was in the pool? Right? Rachel was in the pool also, her sister. So Leah was never eligible. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, even if Rachel dies, Leah still remains in a state of ineligibility. So we'll say, this is the fundamental machlokas, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan essentially says, if you weren't eligible from the beginning, you can never become eligible. But if you were eligible, ineligible, right? Not diseligible. Ineligible, and then subsequently become eligible, you're good to go. So the Gemara says, well, that's machlokas. The Rav, Leslie High Svara, but does Rav not agree with Rabbi Yochanan? V'hamarav, kol isha she'inani kari b'shas nefila yevama yava aleha, harehi ke'isha zakshei shlaban la'asura. But yet Rav said, any woman who at the time, Rav says, shas nefila, b'shas nefila means the moment she becomes eligible for yibum, if you can't apply the pasuk, yevama yava aleha, which means at the moment she becomes eligible, if she can't perform yibum, ultimately, again, she becomes just like Eishes Achshi Yesh Labanim. She becomes just like a brother's wife who has children, i.e., she remains permanently Aser. So the Gemara says, Hanimi lihecha dekai ba'apa iser achos isha daraisa. Let's read again. Avahalcha zeka d'rabanan hi. Here's the difference, says the Gemara. Rav will agree with that when there's an isser daraisa. The boss say, what would be a good case of an isser daraisa? Simple case. Let's say Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are married to 3 sisters, right? Rachel, Leah, and Bilhah. And now Reuven and Shimon die. Ultimately, again, and now Rachel and Leah fall to Levi. What's the halacha? Everyone's fundamentally ineligible. Why? Achos ishto, wife's sister. In that case, where the ineligibility is a result of a da'araisa, Rav will agree, once you're ineligible, you're always ineligible. However, what are we dealing with over here? Saying the concept, and this is very important, the concept of achos zikukaso, the concept of 2 sisters, right? The sister of your zikuka, which is this case, right? Remember again, Reuven and Shimon pass away. Reuven and Shimon are married to 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah fall to Levi. I will say, midda oraisa, is Levi allowed to do yibum with one of these women? Right, he can't do yibum with both of these women because they're married to 2 sisters. But can he do yibum with either one of these women who he chooses, midda oraisa? The answer is yes. The Rabbanan came along and said, yesh zega, right? There's a quasi-marital bond to the women with whom you are waiting to do yibum. And because they're sisters, the problem is rabbinically, if you were to do yibum with any one of them, rabbinically, it's like marrying a woman and her sister. Because think about it this way: if he does yibum with Rachel, so he's married to her, but yet he has a marital bond to Leah. So we'll say this is the Rabbanon. So Rav will say when it's a rabbinic ineligibility, I don't view that as a fundamental ineligibility. So if the rabbinic ineligibility is removed, for example, one of them dies, then yibum becomes permitted. It's only when there's a biblical ineligibility that Allah Alamaisa, if you have that biblical ineligibility at the moment you fall to yibum, that ineligibility remains. Says the Gemara, Eisi Rabbi Yossi Bar Chani Rabbi Yochanan, Arba Achen Beizmen Nishon Beizachayos. Rabbi said these are Mishnah. 4 brothers, 2 of them are married to 2 sisters. Umeisu Hanasunas Achayos. And ultimately, again, so 4 brothers married to 2 of them married to 2 sisters, and the 2 brothers married to the 2, so we'll call them Reuven and Shimon, die. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Hare elu cholzos v'lo Yevamos. Ultimately, again, the widows, you have to do chalitza, no yibum. This is our Mishnah. V'amai, why? Leiku chaminei lachlos la l'shniya, v'tehevi rishona l'gabe idoch ki Yevamos shehutra, v'ne'esra, v'chazra v'hutra, taxra lehetera harishona. Ultimately, we'll say, why is that? Why not just go ahead and have one of the brothers do chalitza, and then the other brother is permitted to do yibum with the remaining wife? In other words, once there's chalitza, ultimately again, then one of the women one of the sisters is out of the picture, and therefore yibum should become permitted with the remaining widow. Because Rav just said the only time that ineligibility remains permanent is when it is biblical ineligibility. But all of this is d'Rabbanan, achos zikukaso. So just go ahead and do chalis with one of the widows, take her out of the picture, the other one should be eligible. Amarlei, achayos, ein yodeh mishnan. This is why Rav said, I don't know who the author of this Mishnah is. Because inachinami, according to Rav, it doesn't make sense. According to Rav, the only type of ineligibility which remains permanent is that which is of a biblical nature. But Allah Lamaisa achos zikukaso, which again is d'Rabbanan. Rabbi say, remember again, I just want to be clear, I want to clarify this point, which is that halacha lamaisa, the case we have been focused on of achos zikukaso, 2 sisters, and an inability for a surviving brother to do yibum with either one of them, that is a din d'Rabbanan. Right? Remember again, midda oraisa, in our case, Reuven and Shimon married to 2 sisters. They die. Both women fall to Levi. Midda oraisa, Levi should be able to do yibum with one of them. Not both of them, obviously, because he can't be married to 2 sisters, but one of them. Why can't he do yibum? There's 2 rabbinic concepts at play over here. Number 1, yesh zika. Right? That's number 1. There's zika. What does zika do? He's maritally connected. No, not married, but maritally connected to both of these women. Well, once that happens, Yibum becomes prohibited, because now the problem is if he does Yibum with either one of them, he's going to be married to one and maritally connected to another. And you can't do that, because that's having a marital bond to two sisters. That's what's at play over here. So Rabbi Yochanan is therefore saying, well, if that's how you fell into the Yibum pool, you are permanently disqualified. Rav says, no. The only time there's a permanent disqualification is when your ineligibility is biblical, is d'oraisa. But in these cases, your ineligibility is d'rabbanan. And therefore what? If the ineligibility is removed, how could the ineligibility be removed? How? Someone dies. That's the easiest way, right? Someone dies. Right, someone dies, although the Gemara says not even someone dies, even if someone does chalitza with one of them, just get someone out of the picture. But for sure, if someone dies, they should be eligible. That's the machlokes Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and that's why Rav says the truth is the Mishnah doesn't really make sense to me. I don't understand who the author was, because L'maisa, there is an easy remedy in the Mishnah. Just do chalitza, remove one of the women, and then the remaining brother should be able to go ahead and do yibum. Incredible. V'lei why doesn't he just answer, my cholzos, nami diktani, cholzos chada? Maybe Rav could say that when the Mishnah says cholzos just means you do chalitza with one of the women, to which the Gemara says cholzos katani. The problem is cholzos is plural, and plural means you have to do chalitza with both women. My cholzos da'alma. Maybe you're just talking about chalitza in a general sense. Hare elu katani. It says these women, i.e. Rachel and the two sisters, both have to do chalitza. I believe with the chalitzlei, they're just trying to reconcile the wording of the Mishnah with Rav. V'leima, the chalitzlei l'rishona b'reisha. Maybe it just means that halacha l'maisa, you do chalitza with the first one first. Chotzos, ultimately, again, l'chatchila katani, top of chav ches. Rabbi says chotzos, Rabbi say, l'shna chotzos v'lo means that halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah is telling you there is no other option to deal with these women other than chalitza. Well, so we've seen these concepts before. Say that maybe the gzeira is that halacha l'maisa, maybe you're going to end up doing chalitza with the first one, and ultimately not end up doing yibum. Rashi says, look at Rashi, gzeira dilma kadim chalas rishona b'reisha, I amrit lahu chalas l'shniya, v'yam rishona sebosai. So according to Rav, the easy way to remedy the case of the Mishnah is do chalitza with the second wife. Now, why? We'll call her Leah. Now, in the case of the two brothers married to the two sisters, where the two brothers die, why is it ideal to do chalitza with the second wife? Why? Think about this. Why? Because remember, she was always ineligible, right? From the moment that Leah fell into the Yibum pool, who was already there? Rachel. So therefore, according to Rav, the easiest way to take care of this is just do chalitza with Leah, and then Rachel, who was permitted, now what? Becomes permitted again. Just go ahead and do that. So the Gemara says, V'lo misyavem es katan. I'm sorry, Gzeira dilma kadim v'chalas l'rishona b'reisha, v'chalas l'rishona b'reisha. So maybe, halacha l'maisa, we're concerned that halacha l'maisa, what's going to happen? Dilma kadim chad v'chalas l'rishona. Maybe we're concerned that someone's going to do chalitza with Rachel, the first wife, and end up doing yibum with Leah. And again, yibum with Leah, even according to Rav, is not an ideal. To which the Gemara says, "V'lo misyavemes katani." The Mishnah says, "Lo misyavemes." So we'll say, "Lo misyavemes" means no yibum, no time, under no circumstances. To which the Gemara says, "Deleka din yibum klal." Deleka din yibum. Deleka din yibum hacha klal. Maybe there's a concern that one of the brothers will die, and then ultimately again we don't want to create a situation where you will negate the mitzvah of yibum. Rabbi Yochanan is not choshesh for misa. Rabbi Lazar he da'amar kevan sha'amda alav shas achas be'iser ne'esra alav olamis. We'll say maybe the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Lazar. And Rabbi Lazar, as we'll see in the Seif of the Mishnah, holds that halacha l'maisa, once you enter into the yibum pool in a shas iser, in other words, once you're usher to do yibum, ultimately again that iser remains on you forever. It cannot be removed. To which the Gemara says, Kevan with the Sefer, thank you. With the Sefer Rabbi Lazar, Reisha Lav Rabbi Lazar. From the fact that Rabbi Lazar is quoted by name in the Sefer, that tells us that ultimately the Reisha is not Rabbi Lazar. The name of the Wohl, Tinafal B'Vasachos. Maybe it was here. This is interesting. maybe the reason why the Mishnah mandates. So we'll say, just understand. We're just trying to figure out why isn't there a remedy in the Mishnah? In other words, that halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah says in this case, the Mishnah frames it as 4 brothers, right? 4 brothers, 2 of whom married to 2 sisters. The 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon, married to their 2 sisters, die. Their widows fall to the other brothers, Rachel and Leah. So the Mishnah said, Cholzos v'lo misyavos. They have to chalitza, they can't do yibum. To which the Gemara says, the Gemara is trying to figure out why. In other words, you could come up with scenarios where yibum would be permitted. According to Rabbi Yochanan, a little bit more difficult, but according to Rav, much less difficult. So we're just going through the possibilities. To which the Gemara says, V'nei malu d'nafal v'asachas. Oh, very interesting. Maybe the problem in our Mishnah is that what? Reuven and Shimon died at the same time. The Rabbi will say, what's the problem if Reuven and Shimon died at the same time? See, our whole discussion over here is predicated on one wife being first, one wife being second. The first wife being first had a window of yibum permissibility. The second wife did not. Well, maybe the case is they died at the same time. So because they died at the same time, ultimately, again, both women have to be treated as safek, and therefore only chalitza is possible, not yibum. Rabbi Yosei Lili, and again, our Mishnah Rabbi Yosei Lili, because Rabbi Yosei Lili says it is possible to be precise. It is possible to be exact. To which the Gemara says, ultimately we'll say generally a stam mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yosef Lili. Maybe we'll say we don't know ultimately again who came into the Yibum pool first. Ultimately, we'll say that's why the Mishnah says if halacha l'maisa one of the brothers. So again, the psak of the Mishnah is cholzos v'lo misyavmos. You have to chalitza, you can't do yibum. If that's the case, this is why the Mishnah says. So if maybe we're talking about a case where halacha l'maisa, we don't know which sister or which brother died first, which sister became eligible first. If that's the case, then when the Mishnah says kidmu v'kinsu yotziu, that halacha l'maisa, if one of the brothers went ahead and did yibum with one of the women, he has to divorce her. Bishlama, so let's analyze this. Bishlama, Rishona Amrinan Le, Man Shari Lacha. So I understand ultimately again why the first brother, if he does yibum, ultimately again we make him divorce his wife, because we tell him who permitted you to do this. Elashnia Amar, but the second brother could always say, Chavroi Shnia Yibam. The second brother could always say, oh, my brother, he did yibum with the second wife. Ana Rishon Miyabim. But I did yibum with the first wife. And ultimately, again, the yibum with the first wife, halacha l'maisa, could be technically permitted. Because remember, again, once ultimately, again, yibum is done with the second wife, so to speak, she's out of the picture, in which case one can make the argument that the first wife returned to her previously permitted state. We'll say this is why Rav says, Achayos enu yodea mi shinan. Ultimately, again, this is why Rav said, I don't know who the author of this Mishnah is. Because according to Rav, it's hard to understand the Mishnah, because the Mishnah makes it sound like there's no possibility of Yibum. But according to Rav's position, there should be possibilities of Yibum. Again, it could be that more often than not, the way to approach it will be Chalitza, but Lamaisa, there are absolutely possibilities of Yibum in this scenario. So we'll read a little bit later, then I'll show you the Rambam. Tanan. Actually, we'll say before we get to this, let me read this to you. So this is the Rambam in Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza, Perek Zayin. So listen to this. Meis echa min ha'achin, v'nafla ishto liyibum, v'achar kach meis sheni v'nafla ishto liyibum, shi achos harishon of our ishten kayamos. So the Rambam, this is the case of our Mishnah. Reuven and Shimon, again, it's actually a straightforward case. Reuven and Shimon married to 2 sisters. Third brother, Levi, not married to another one of the sisters. Okay? Now what happens? Reuven dies. His wife Rachel falls for Yibum. Shimon dies. His wife Leah falls for Yibum. What's Talacha, says the Rambam? Shtehen cholzos v'lo misyapmos kimo sheve arnu. So we'll say, we paskin that Allah L'maisa Levi has only one option. What's his option? Chalitza. Again, let's go through why. Number one, why? Why? Yesh Zika, excellent. Therefore, marital bond to both of them. And therefore, what? Yibum becomes impossible. Why? Because let's play this out. If he does Yibum with one of the women, what effectively happens? He's married to one sister and has a marital bond to another sister. And that's problematic. Okay, good. So that's the Rambam Paskins. Now, watch this. What about our case? Mesa ha'achron. Listen how the Rambam starts. So this is it. That was Perek Zayin Halacha Gimel. This is now Perek Zayin Halacha Dalid. So Mesa ha'achrona. So now let's play this out. Achrona, the second Yevama, we'll call her wife. The second widow dies. Who's the second widow? That's Leah. Right? Leah dies. Chazra harishona lehetera v'choletzes o misyavemes. Wow. Rambam Paskins like Rav. Rambam Paskins like Rav. When Leah dies, ultimately again, Rachel becomes permitted again. So I say that's the again is very important, right? Because remember again, Rachel was permitted in Yibum, right? Then she becomes Asura when Leah comes into the pool. If Leah dies, Rachel once again becomes permitted. Mesa harishona, but what happens if Rachel dies? For wife, right? Widow number one. What happens if widow number one dies? Mesa harishona, hari achrona, beisura omedes, v'choletzes v'lo misyabemes. The Rambam Paskins, however, halacha l'maisa, if Rachel dies, ultimately Leah remains prohibited for Yibum and only Chalitza. Why? Here we go. Shahari lo haisa re'uya liyibum b'shas nifilasa. But see, this is how the Rambam Paskins. Because halacha l'maisa, in order to be eligible for Yibum, at the moment you fall for Yibum, you have to be completely, biblically and rabbinically eligible. Right? In other words, if you were ineligible on any level at the moment you fell into the Yibum pool, that ineligibility remains. It remains. So it's a little bit of a hybrid model to Rambam Paskins. He's Paskin like Rav and like Rabbi Yochanan. So Rachel, who was eligible and then became ineligible, if Leah dies, ultimately again she becomes eligible again. But Leah, who was ineligible from the beginning, albeit rabbinically, right? Even if Rachel dies afterwards, still there's no option with Yibum for her. Therefore, again, the Chaynim Kadam Acham Min Acham V'Chalas La'Achrona Hutra Harishon L'Shara Achin Shara Zika Sh'Asr Osa Asira Acham B'Chazam. Also, listen to this. This is the last case we just read in the Rambam. Therefore, the Rambam takes one step further. This is literally the case we just read. Let's watch this. Watch this. What happens? Same case. If let's say there were four. Let's go with four brothers. Right. So the fourth brother, we'll call him Yehuda. Right. So Yehuda came along, and what did he do? Yehuda did chalitza with Leah. Yehuda did chalitza with Leah. If Yehuda did chalitza with Leah, then what? Rachel becomes permitted again. It's the same idea. So whether you do chalitza with Leah or Leah dies, essentially once Leah is out of the picture, then what? Rachel once again becomes permitted in Yibum. So again, I will say that's how the Rambam Paskins effectively like Rav, just adding in here what the Gemara just said, that it's not just the death of Leah that once again permits Rachel in Yibum, but ultimately again, the removal of Leah, either through death or ultimately through Chalitz. Incredible. So we'll say, so Yesh Seika, Achos Zikukaso is Dirabanon. If you come into the Yibum pool and you are ineligible from the moment you came in, whether biblically or rabbinically, that ineligibility precludes you from Yibum forever. But ultimately, again, if you were eligible, then became ineligible, but then ultimately became eligible again, Yibum once again becomes permitted. Incredible. Well, so let's go weiter. Says the Gemara, Tanan, Haisa Achas min Asura ala Echad Isra Erva. Listen to this. If one of the sisters was prohibited to one of the brothers as an Isra Erva, Asr ba umutra ba'achosa. So I'll say, so remember how this works. Let's say again the two cases. Let's say, right, Reuven and Shimon die, and they're married to two sisters. But it happens to be that one of the sisters, we'll call it Rachel, is Levi's mother-in-law. Right? It's Levi's mother-in-law. Okay, whatever. Complicated family. Right? Levi's mother-in-law. So I'll say, so now remember again, mother-in-law is an erva. Mother-in-law is an erva. Remember again, I'll say, what's the halacha? An erva essentially is removed from the Yibum pool in totality. Because of that, the erva doesn't have an impact on the other women in the pool. Now, I will say, don't get confused about this. It's a little late for that. Right? But listen to this. What I want to point out is, remember, an erva has an impact on the other wives. In which case? When they're all the wives of the same man. Right? That's our first Mishnah. That's right. Dr. Langbaum and I were discussing this after Mincha yesterday. Hey, so ultimately, again, if a man, right, if one man is married to two women, and one of those women is an erva to the other brother, the erva wife has an impact on the other. This case is different, because remember, in this case over here, Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, right? Both of them die. They both fall in Yibum to Levi. One of those women happens to be an erva to Levi. We'll call her Rachel as Levi's mother-in-law. So the halacha is also what the Gemara is saying over here is, because of that, we don't, in other words, Rachel and Leah are sisters, but also Rachel's also an erva to Levi. Well, once Rachel's an erva to Levi, she's totally out of the pool, right? She's not shaykh to Yibum. Once she's not shaykh to Yibum, she does not have a negative Yibum effect on the other wife, on Leah. So that's what it's saying. If Rachel was an erva ultimately to Levi, asr. Obviously, Levi can't go ahead and do Yibum with her, but Levi can do Yibum with her sister. But ultimately, the second brother is going to be asr on both of them. Right? So we'll say if there's a fourth brother, Yehuda can't do Yibum with either of them. Now, why can't Yehuda do Yibum with either of them? Because this goes back to the regular case, achos zikukaso. Because remember, by Yehuda, there's no erva. You just have two sisters, a rabbinic issue of doing Yibum of achos zikukaso. It's incredible. So what's the case? What's the case? If we're talking about where Rachel, who's Levi's mother-in-law, fell into the Yibum pool first, v'amai lekuchas liyabim hachte ina chamosa bereisha, v'tehave chamosa legabe idach ki Yevamos shehotra v'nesra v'chazra v'hotra tachsra lehetera harishona. Why don't we just go ahead and say that ultimately, again, let Levi go ahead and do Yibum, ultimately, again, with Leah, the second wife, and therefore, Allah l'maisa, let Rachel, who's Levi's mother-in-law, but unrelated ultimately to Yehuda, to the fourth brother, let her be like a woman who was permitted, became prohibited, and then subsequently became permitted again, in which case Yibum is permitted. Because what's the case? Very simple. The case is where Leah became the widow first. She fell into the Yibum pool first, and therefore Allah L'maisa, that calculation won't work. So we'll say the takeaway, again, I'm trying to give you the takeaways from each of these. The takeaway from this case, I will say, is that in the case of the sisters that fall to the surviving brothers, if one of those sisters is an erva to the surviving brother, she's removed from the pool. If she's removed from the pool, then she does not generate a problem of achos zikukaso. So ultimately, again, she's viewed as if she's not even in the Yibum pool at all, and therefore, Allah l'maisa, the surviving brother would be able to do Yibum, Levi would be able to do Yibum with the widow to whom he is not related, to the widow with whom is not an erva to him. Pretty incredible. Rabbi Elazar Rishami Omrim. So we'll say, remember again, Rabbi Elazar said in the Mishnah that Allah Beis Shammai said that if the brothers went ahead and married one of these women, that Allah said they don't have to divorce her. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Elazar Beis Shammai Yakimu, or Beis Hillel Yotziu. Beis Hillel says you have to divorce. Rabbi Shimon Yakaimu. Rabbi Shimon says you could keep them. In other words, Allah if they married, you could keep the marriage. Abashal Omer Kal Hayalahem LeBeis Hillel B'Davar Zeh. Ultimately, again, Beis Hillel were makel. Beis Shammai omrim yotziu. Beis Shammai says that Allah l'maisa, you have to divorce. Beis Hillel omrim yikaimu. Beis Hillel says you could keep them, you could keep married. Rabbi Shimon Kiman. What does Rabbi Shimon hold like? Iki Beis Shammai and Rabbi Elazar. If he was like Beis Shammai, then he's saying the same thing as Rabbi Elazar. Iki Beis Hillel haina Abashol. And if it's like Beis Hillel, then he's holding like Abashol. Hachi Kamer. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Shimon is actually saying something fundamentally different. Lo nechel ku Beis Shammai sil b'davar zeh. But Rabbi Shimon is saying that Allah l'maisa, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai don't argue, and both of them agree that although the brothers are not supposed to do Yibum, if they did do Yibum, ultimately they could remain married. So I will say, so just a machlokes over here on attribution of positions and the position of Reb Shimon. So I will say, so again, the goal over here is just keep in mind the takeaways that we're getting from each segment over here. That last piece was just about attribution in the Mishnah. Good. Weiter. Haisa achas mehen. So I will say this next statement in the Mishnah was, listen to this case. Haisa achas mehen asura al zeh. Va'a isra erva, va'ashniya isura al zeh isra erva. So we'll say, now watch this. Same case, right? 4 brothers, 2 of them married to 2 sisters. Reuven and Shimon married to Rachel and Leah. Reuven and Shimon die. Rachel and Leah now fall to Levi and Yehuda. So imagine the following situation. Rachel is an erva to Levi, but not an erva to Yehuda. And Leah is an erva to Yehuda, but not an erva to Levi. So I'll say, this is a good case. What can you do? So ha'asur lazeh mutaris lazeh, ba'asur lazeh mutaris lazeh. So what do we just say? When a woman is an erva, what's her place in the Yibum pool? She's out of the Yibum pool. So it's actually an easier case, because in this case, halacha l'maisa, what do we say? That the truth is technically, so Levi could do Yibum with the woman who's not an erva to him, and Yehuda could do Yibum with the woman who's not an erva to him. So the Gemara says, Tanina Chadazin, we already learned this one time. We already learned this before. Achose kishi yivimta, ochol leses of Yevamos. So we already learned this. A case of a sister who's a Yevama, does chalitza or does yibum. We already learned this case. Tzricha, you need it. I'll tell you why. Also, all the Gemara is pointing out is we've already learned this principle before. That halacha l'maisa, when a woman is in erva, she is considered to be out of the yibum pool, and therefore does not complicate yibum for the other women. We already learned this once. To which the Gemara says it's necessary to state it again. Why? Diashmin and Hasam mishum deleka lemigzer mishum sheni. You might have thought only in the previous. Previously we learned it vis-a-vis one brother, one yavam. So you might have thought maybe in the case of one brother. Ultimately, again, we can do it because halacha l'maisa, there's no concern that perhaps the brothers may end up doing yibum with the wrong wives or the wrong widows. But here maybe there should be a concern because of confusion. Or maybe you'll see over here that halacha l'maisa, in this case it's permitted. Why? Because there are two brothers. And therefore it's clear one brother is marrying the woman who's not an erva to him. The other brother is not marrying a woman who's an erva to him. But in the case where there's not a second brother, maybe halacha l'maisa, I should be concerned that if we allow them to get married, that people might think that achos zikukaso is mutar, therefore tzricha. Shabbos says so again. All the Gemara is saying over here is this case of two brothers is different than the previous stated case where there's only one surviving brother, even though they're stating the same principle. And what is the principle? When you have a case of sisters who fall into the Yibum pool, again I will say sisters, but sisters married to two different men, right? Always the case. Reuven and Shimon married to two sisters fall into the Yibum pool. Under normal circumstances, let's go through this now. Under normal circumstances, when those two, Levi, let's call it Levi, right? Levi and Yehuda. What's the halacha for Levi and Yehuda when those two sisters fall into the Yibum pool? In a general case, what's the halacha? Chalitza. Why? Yesh zika, and therefore, achos zikukaso. That's it. Now the Mishnah introduces, but if one of those women is an erva, that's good news. So let's say Rachel is Levi's mother-in-law. Fantastic. Why? You understand what I mean, right? Fantastic. Why? Because Lamaisa now, what happens if Rachel's Levi's mother-in-law? What happens now? She's out. If she's out, there's no achos zikukasu anymore. All the Mishnah just did is just made an interesting case. Where imagine for a moment you've got two sisters, and imagine for a moment that Rachel is Levi's mother-in-law. And Leah is Yehuda's mother-in-law. Fantastic. Therefore, I will say what? So the halacha is each man could do yibum with the woman, with the widow, who's not his mother-in-law. Because essentially what the erva does is it removes one woman from the pool for each of the brothers. So essentially in the yibum pool, there's only one woman for each brother, and therefore it's permitted. Good. Isser mitzvah. So we'll say again, the next statement of the Mishnah was as follows. That what happens if you have a woman who's an Isser Mitzvah or Isser Kedusha? So we'll say, let's say these sisters who fall into the Yibum pool, one of them is an Isser Mitzvah. Also remember again, we've seen what is Isser Mitzvah? A little Chazar, what's Isser Mitzvah? Shnios. Right? Isser Mitzvah, Shnios, rabbinically prohibited. Isser Kedusha is either like a Mamzeres or a Grusha for a Kohen. So what happens if any of these sisters is an Isser Mitzvah or Isser Kedusha? So remember again, the Mishnah again said, Choletzes v'lo misyavemes. You do chalitza, not do yibum. The Gemara says, Hanami tanina. We learned this already. We'll say, these are not new concepts. We learned this already. It goes quickly. Don't get scared by the size of the page, right? It's agarata. No, I'm just kidding. It's not agarata. Right? So says the Gemara, Isser Mitzvah, Isser Kedusha, Choletzes v'lo misyavemes. Don't say, we learned this already. Actually, what we're going to see is this whole Gemara is this same discussion. We've actually learned all of these concepts already. We've learned already Isra mitzvah choletzes v'lo misyavemes. So we'll say we learned this halacha l'maisa. If a woman is prohibited either because she's an Isser D'Rabbanan or ultimately again allowed. Let's remember again, how do we paskin? Kiddushin Tovsin B'chai Be'lavin. We don't pass like Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the only opinion who holds that Kiddushin doesn't take effect in a scenario where there's a lav. We paskin Kiddushin takes effect with a lav. The only time Kiddushin doesn't take effect is when? Isser Karis. But Lamaisa, so we'll say therefore again, because Kiddushin could take effect, therefore Chalitza is necessary. Chalitza. So where do you learn this? To which the Gemara says, Hasam Isra Mitzvah L'chuda. There, say in the previous case we were just learning an Isra Mitzvah by itself. Here it's a bit more complicated. Why? Because we will say in this case in our Mishnah, Hacha Isra Mitzvah V'achosa. So we will say the women in the Mishnah, remember again, really have two issues. Right? Number one, this woman is an Isra Mitzvah, so let's say she's a Shniya, right? She's a rabbinic erva, and also what? She's the sister of the other woman in the Yibum pool. So Sakalai Tamin Aleikum Isra Mitzvah B'makom Isra Erva V'tisyabeim. Maybe, I will say first why line Chag Kasher V'Sameach, this is fascinating. Maybe what we do in this case is like this. Take her Isra Mitzvah, right? Her Isra Mitzvah status, transform it into an Isra Erva. Now both sides. What's the beauty of transforming Isra Mitzvah into an Isra Erva? What does that do? Removes her from the pool. And therefore, V'tisyabeim, and therefore again, let her do Yibum. Kamash Malan, we don't do that. I V'tisyabeim, Kevim D'Midaris Aramya Kamei, Kapaga Ba'achos Bizukaso. V'tisyabeim, the Gemara says, how can you even think about that you could do Yibum? Since ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, that da'oraisa, ultimately, technically, could marry her, don't you get into a problem of achos zikukaso? You would have thought that because the mitzvah ultimately, because mitzvah yibum, maybe Chazal would suspend this, achos zikukaso, kamash malan, no. Good, so I'll say, so all the Gemara is saying is that even though we have already learned that a woman, a yevama, who is asr midrabanan on her yavam, on the surviving brother, that she has to do chalitza and can't do yibum. We've already learned that case before. The Mishnah just restates it because this case has the additional layer that the woman in question is not only an Isra Mitzvah, but what else is she? Achos Zikuka. So she's also the wife of the other, she's also the sister of the other wife in the Yibum pool. Beautiful. Haisa Achas man. So also remember again, this was the case in the Mishnah. Haisa Achas man Asura al Zeh Isra Erva. Right, so also going back to the case we said before, this was the case where imagine for a moment, Rachel is an erva to Levi, and Leah is an erva to Yehuda. So each is an erva to one of the other brothers. So remember again, in that case, each brother is permitted to do yibum to the widow who's not his erva. Because remember again, erva removes you from the yibum pool, therefore the other woman becomes eligible. Says the Gemara, Haisa achazmen hasu la'amali hainuhach. And I was ready to learn this. Mali lechad, mali letrei. Now we'll say we've already learned this principle. Tzvicha diashin hasa mishum diika sheni demuchach. So we'll say I would have felt as follows. It's necessary. Why? Because in this case where there's a second brother. Because there's a second brother, so the circumstances become a bit clearer that you're not marrying achos zikukaso. That each brother is clearly marrying the woman who's not an erva to him. Avahocha. The leka sheni de kamuchach emolo, but perhaps again when there's not a second brother, perhaps we should be concerned that it looks like you're marrying achos zikukaso. V'yashmolim hachad adraba tarvayu muchi adadi aval idach lo tzricha. But on the other hand, that halacha l'maisa, I might have thought just the opposite. That perhaps ultimately, again, the presence of two brothers is muchach, one on the other, but in the other case not. Therefore, tzricha. But say it's the same pattern in the Gemara. All the Gemara just keeps on highlighting is a lot of the concepts brought up in this Mishnah we've already seen before, but the Mishnah just adds an additional layer of halachic uniqueness. Good. Zohi sha'amru. So I will say this is something. Just keep the place. Right? The Mishnah said Zohi sha'amru. This is what we said. Achos ish so achosa kishi yevimta ocho letzes o misyavemes. So I will say this Mishnah ended with this statement. This is what we mean when we say, or this is what was stated before, that literally again, her sister, who's also her yevama, does chalitza or does yibum. I'm sorry, o chaletzes o misyavemes. Now both say, now remember again, what the Mishnah is saying is something very interesting, that there are cases of sisters who are co-wives, of sisters who are, wrong way to say it. There are cases of sisters who are yevamos, right? Not co-wives, right? That's our case over here. Reuven and Shimon married to two sisters, right? Reuven and Shimon die. Now you have two sisters, they're not co-wives, two sisters, ultimately you fall into the Yibum pool together. Shabbos say, there are times where those women could do Yibum or Chalitza, and there are times when those women could only do Chalitza. Working backwards, when can they only do Chalitza? When can they only do Chalitza? Well, in all the cases in the Mishnah, which is the cases where you have the issue of Achos Zikukaso. When can they do Yibum also? When there's an erva. Right? When there's an erva. When there's an erva, then ultimately, again, the presence of erva essentially removes one of them from the pool and allows Yibum for the other. So the Gemara says, Zohi l'mi'utei mai. We'll say in general, when the Mishnah uses lashon of Zohi, this is a case generally that comes to exclude something else. So what is it coming to exclude over here? Zohi l'mi'utei mai, l'mi'utei isra mitzvah l'zeh, ve'isra mitzvah l'zeh. Very interesting, I will say. What happens in the following case? Imagine for a moment, Rachel is an Isra Mitzvah, right? Is an Erva D'Rabbanan to Levi, and Leah is an Erva D'Rabbanan or Shnia, which is Isra Mitzvah to Yehuda. So I will say that in order to be pulled out of the Yibum pool, being a Shnia is not enough. Isra Mitzvah is not enough. It has to be an Isra Erva D'Oraisa. So ultimately, it's coming to exclude that case. So the Gemara says, so has Sulamali Hainuhach Malichad Mali. First of all, we learned this already. So we already spoke about this in the case of one surviving brother. Why do you have to bring it down over here in the case of two surviving brothers? What would you have thought? Kila Aminan Uki Isra Mitzvah B'Makom Isra Erva Heicha Di'ika L'Migzar Mishum Sheni. I might have thought Rabbi said that when do we not say that ultimately an Isra Mitzvah becomes an Isra Erva? That's when Halacha L'Maisa perhaps you should be concerned about the second brother. Aval heicha deleka lamigzar mishum sheni, or there is no concern regarding the second. Ema lahai ukimna isra mitzvah makom isra erba, ulahai ukimna isra mitzvah makom isra erba. V'liyavmu, I would say that Allah l'maisa make an isra mitzvah, meaning an isra erva d'rabanan, like an isra erva d'oraisa. Remove the woman from the pool and allow the other brother to do yibum with the remaining wife. Kamash Malano. Kamash Malano said that Allah Lamaisa, the only time an Isser Erva pulls a woman out of the Yibum pool is when it is an Isser Erva D'Oraisa. But what we call an Isser Mitzvah, which is an Erva D'Rabbanan, that does not pull a woman out of the Yibum pool. Amr Avudu Rav, V'chin Tana B'chia. So now we're going back to the first Mishnah. But remember again, the first Mishnah in the Masechta, the 15 women, right? The 15 women we had. Chamesh asrei nashim potros tsarosein v'tsaros tsarosein min hachalitza or min hayibum ad sof kol olam. There are 15 women, I will say, who ultimately themselves are pater from Yibum and from Chalitza, and ultimately again pater their co-wives. And remember, we had the case of co-wife as well from Yibum and Chalitza. So let's go back to this for just a moment. It says the Gemara, in all of these cases, I say about them, or back to these 15 women, ha'asur lazeh muteres lazeh. Right? Rabbi said that. Remember again, the 15 women in the Mishnah were specific erva relationships. Right? So remember again, so ultimately I will say you could have a situation where there are multiple surviving brothers, but Allah Lamaisa what? The women in question may only be an Isra Erva to one. So remember again, if you're an Isra Erva to one brother, the only brother you're prohibited to is who? The brother to whom you are an Isra Erva. But the other brothers, ultimately again, you're not prohibited to. I will say, what about the case ultimately again of two sisters who are in the same Yibum pool? That's our Mishnah over here. Ochol, that says Omis Yadames. Could do Chalitza or could do Yibum. Because you also remember again, what does this refer to? In a case where in the Yibum pool, the two sisters, Rachel and Leah, right? Two sisters from two different husbands. When those two sisters come into the same Yibum pool and one of them is an Erva, then what? Ochol, that says Omis Yadames. One of them is pulled out, and therefore the surviving brother has the right to either do Chalitza or Yibum with the remaining sister. Rabbi Yehuda said that Allah Chamaisa, this principle only applies to the case of mother-in-law and on. Aval shisa bavi dereisha, but the first 6 women, we actually had this Gemara before. But the first 6 women, lo, my time, what's the reason why it doesn't apply to them? Kevan debito ba'onsin hu de mishkachas lo, benisuin lo mishkachas lo, benisuin kamari ba'onsin lo kamari. Ultimately, the case of his daughter, which was the case of a daughter that comes from an act of a man who violated a woman, that is a case of violation, not a case of marriage. That's not included in the tally. Abai included even the case of daughter who came from the case of violation. Why? You could have the case of bito, both from the case of violation as well as from the case ultimately of marriage. Rabbi said we don't include in this principle the case of a brother who was not alive at the same time as the now deceased brother. Remember again, we actually had this, we already learned this Gemara. Ultimately, since the case, of the brother who was not alive at the same time as his deceased brother is subject to machlokes, ultimately, again, we don't include that in the tally. Rav Safra includes even the case of the brother who wasn't alive at the same time as his now deceased brother. We will say this could come up in an interesting case, which we're not really going to get too into, but the case of 6 brothers. And I will say, watch this case of 6 brothers. Ultimately, again, the case of 6 brothers goes according to Rabbi Shimon. This simarach, and the way to remember this is Meis Nolad V'Yavam. Meis Nolad V'Yavam. Rabbi will say that's the order over here. Ultimately, again, brother died, another brother was born, then Yibum occurs. Ultimately, again, brother dies, another brother is born, then Yibum occurs. So we'll say here's the case. Ruvain v'Shimon nisuin shtei achayos. Ruvain and Shimon are married ultimately to 2 sisters. Levi v'Yehuda nisuin shtei nachrios. Levi and Yehuda are married to 2 other women, unrelated women. Meis, we'll say, watch this. Meis Ruvain, nolad Yisachar. So Ruvain dies, and ultimately Yisachar is born. And then after Yisachar is born, v'Yavam Levi. Then Levi does Yibam with Ruvain's wife. Meis Shimon. Then Shimon dies. Nolad Zvulun. Zvulun is born after that. Rabbi say, but remember again, Yisachar was already alive at the time that Shimon, that Levi died. Nolad Zvulun. V'Yavim Yehuda. And now ultimately again, Yehuda did Yibam with Shimon's widow. Meisu Levi v'Yehuda b'Labanim. Now I'll say what happens. Levi and Yehuda die without sons. V'naflu lahu kamei Yisachar u'Zvulun. And now their wives ultimately come before Yisachar and Zvulun. Yisachar, who was born after Reuven died, and Zvulun, who was born after Shimon died. Hasur lazeh muteres lazeh, v'asur lazeh muteres lazeh. Ultimately, I will say, so again, it's actually not a complicated case. But halacha l'maisa, the wife who is prohibited ultimately, again, to Yisachar is permitted to Zvulun, and the wife who is prohibited to Zvulun ultimately is permitted to Yisachar. To which the Gemara says, v'achosa shehi yevimta. Lamali, so the Gemara says, Lamali Yibam Yehuda below, Lamali Yibam Yehuda below Yibam, Lamali Yibam Yehuda. Why do you the case ultimately Yehuda did Yibum? Below Yibum Yehuda, not Mishkachas law. The case works even if Yehuda never did Yibum, Mishum Tzara. Ultimately, says the Gemara, Hatrinach Tzara. That works fine ultimately in the case of a co-wife. Tzara de Tzara, my ikala meimar. But what about the case of the co-wife's co-wife? How does that come up in this case? Kegon dahadar v'yabinhu nami gad v'asher. We'll say ultimately again it could come up in a case. If you look at Rashi, actually we're going to leave Rashi for now. Right? Allah might come up in a case ultimately again where gad v'asher, additional brothers come into the case over here. Ultimately did Yibum as well. So we'll say so again. All of that is just an illustration of how you could have a case of Eshes Achiv Shalahaya, or Achiv Shalahaya Ba'olamo. Ultimately, again, how you could have a case of non-concurrent brothers that would not be subject to machlokes. That's the case of Shisha Achim. We're actually going to get into that case in Yevamos Hashem a little bit in the days ahead as well. I will say, the goal over here in this sugya is in Yevamos Hashem just to remember the takeaways that we get from each of the particular yisod. So I will say, I just want to point out the entire sugya we did, kind of up until that last case of Shisha Achim, that case that didn't do justice to, but we're going to see that case. That case is going to be its own sugya. Halakha l'maisa is really just the Gemara going through the Mishnah, taking apart our Mishnah line by line, and trying to figure out why halakha l'maisa do we need to restate the cases in the Mishnah. Because also, if you think about it, all the Gemara was saying was like this. The cases in the Mishnah are all principles we've seen before. Was there in our Mishnah in the previous iterations of the case? Our Mishnah deals with two brothers, right? Two surviving brothers. The previous Mishnahs were dealing with what? Dealing with what? One brother. So why do you have to restate the same principle dealing with multiple brothers? Halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara says, just because they add in an additional layer of complexity. Let me start the Mishnah. Mishnah. Shlosha achin, shnai mehen nesuin shtei achayos. Well, so here we go. Here we go. We're not finished. I know you thought the even cases were over. We're not finished. Three brothers. Two of whom are married to two sisters. Oh, Isha Obita. So I'll say, so now we're just varying it up a little bit. And you're going to see it becomes quite fascinating now. So listen to this. You have three brothers, two of whom, Reuven and Shimon, ultimately are married to two sisters. Or for that matter, again, Reuven and Shimon are married, Isha Obita, to a mother and a daughter. Oh, Isha Obasbita, or to a mother and a granddaughter. We'll say, again, not same man, right? So again, this is the same thing. Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven and Shimon are either married to two sisters, or for that matter, again, two sisters, or a woman and her daughter, or a woman and her granddaughter, or a woman ubaspina, again, when you say her daughter's daughter, or a woman and her son's daughter. What's the halacha? And now we'll say what happens. Reuven and Shimon die, and now again the two wives fall into the pool for Levi. Hari luchotzos v'lo misyabmos. Ultimately, again, the zumin du chalitza and not yib. I will say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up at Mirat Hashem. I will say again, same principles we've learned. We're just going to apply them to different cases. In Mirat Hashem to be continuing tomorrow. Shkoyach. Same brother. It's probably true. Thank you, Hashem.
Looking forward to the review.